This episode fueled by Mudwater. Follow the link in the description to get a crazy deal on your first order of mud. My name is Michael. I've been absolutely fascinated by tabletop role-playing games for the better part of my life, and if you know somebody who prefers THAC0, you should report them immediately to your local authorities. See something, say something, friends, and welcome to Roll With Me. So, in past episodes, I have talked a little bit about how hunters can approach combat, and I've just barely touched on how to approach the big boss fight, how to get up to that big boss fight. But a lot of you guys have been asking me for that combat episode, the Keeper edition, if you will. So here we go. And thinking about this topic, it occurred to me that I'm not super often on point when I am talking about concepts in Monster of the Week. I kind of like vaguely touch on an idea and like toss it your way, and I'm like, you get it, right? And the concept of combat is so important to the full experience of Monster of the Week, and it is so big and so nuanced that I realized I could not half-ass this episode for you guys. I had to get serious. I had to whole-ass this episode. I want to put you firmly into the mindset to run the best and most immersive combat possible in Monster of the Week. And to do that, first, we need to get into the mind of the monster.
You don't know what it's like to be human.
The key to understanding the flow of combat, and really the flow of the rest of your campaign, is understanding your monster. Whether it is a mindless zombie, a hungry were-hippo, or a highly developed alien race, every monster has some motivation, something that drives them to do what they do. Wendigos want to eat, pixies want to steal your shit, and Rakshasas want whatever they want.
I don't have much planned tonight, but I did learn a magic trick.
So today, we're going to take a look at a couple of monster types from the Keeper section of the Monster of the Week rulebook by Michael Sands, and we're going to take a look at how they might handle a combat situation. First, let's consider a lesser monster like a zombie or a ghoul. What do they want? When do they want them? A zombo really just wants to eat. Whether it runs in head-on, full berserker mode like Train to Busan, or it shambles around like the ever-classic Night of the Living Dead, it's always going to one location: food. A simple motivation, but a powerful one nonetheless. What makes a zombie combat... Zombat? What makes a zombat interesting isn't exactly what the monsters are doing. We know what they're doing. They're trying to eat. They want brains, right? It's the circumstances that surround the situation, and who else is involved in the immediate situation, and where they're coming from, right? Chances are, if you've got some bystanders or a squishy-looking mundane kicking around, things might go to hell real quick. If a ghoul or a zombie can turn the living into more ghouls or zombies, then this combat scenario could result in the end of an outbreak or the end of the world.
The dead will walk the earth.
So now it's up to the Keeper to keep those stakes exactly that high throughout the entire combat, right? The way we do this is by staging this encounter in an area or areas that pose a threat to the entire town or community that we're trying to protect, right? The zombos aren't just rising up from one little small town cemetery. They are rising in small numbers in every cemetery in town, right? The threat is imminent, and our hunters need to rush to the rescue. Now, once we enter combat, it is time to enter the minds of the Zombos. If they have any semblance of intelligence, they'll know right off the bat who their prime targets are, any innocent bystanders, civilians, or your squishy-looking mundane. Because it wouldn't be nearly as cool if a horde of ghouls or zombos just headed straight for the big beefy monstrous or the heavily armed professional or the wronged to just get their heads blown off immediately. There's gotta be some danger. Now, we all know how to get rid of a zombie.
By removing the head or destroying the brain.
And guns are going to be your hunter's best friends in a war against the dead, in a game where entering melee combat means receiving harm. Because maybe that harm could come from a bite. And to keep themselves from being transformed into mindless, brain-eating monstrosities, they'll probably turn to range combat. So maybe it's raining and dark. The less interesting our monster, the more interesting our circumstances need to be. Because the zombie concept is so simple, we need to rely on complications from outside, right, in the situation to make the combat more gripping. So maybe if your gunner gets disarmed, that gun falls into a mud puddle. And in a dark and stormy night situation, it might take some time that the hunters really don't have to locate that gun. And when they do, maybe that gun won't fire until they service it after the combat, if they survive. And hey, if one of your hunters does get bitten by a zombie, maybe that's the start of a whole new campaign arc to find a cure. Or maybe it's time for your player to roll a new character, or switch their playbook from the mundane to the monstrous. I'm a monster! But let's say our hunters get the better of the ghouly zombo knuckleheads and they realize this zombie attack wasn't just an isolated incident, no. It was the work of something far more powerful and far more sinister. Something like the spirit of a long-dead witch come to town to raise a little hell. Now we're looking at a torturer. Her motivation? To harm and terrify. After a long and grueling investigation, our hunters will discover where she came from, how to stop her, and where to find her now. As the crew comes together in our Avengers assembling moment that we talked about last week, which if you haven't seen that episode, you should definitely go and check it out. It's pretty decent, and I've got a lot of other tips and tricks on the channel, and also like a Patreon thing, a bunch of content and stuff. Just head over there after this episode and like check it out. Anyway, it's time to fight an undead witch. Let's take a look at how she might handle a combat situation with our hunters. Now, it's not going to be a very fun fight if the witch is just gonna run around and try to punch the hunters in the face. So let's think of some powers that she might have, right? As a general rule of thumb, we can give her any of the magical powers from the Use Magic template in the core rulebook, right? So she can cause harm or heal harm or bar a place or portal or etc., etc., etc. We can flavor these spells and hexes with some really creepy horror stuff. Remember, dealing harm isn't the only option, right? Slamming someone against a tree with your mind or magical powers is cool, I guess, but making them cough up live bees is goddamn terrifying. We can always play with horror in combat situations, regardless of what monster we are running. Let your imagination run wild, right? Let's do some scary Blair Witch shit, right? Have the witch put hallucinations in their head. Maybe they see a long dead loved one all zombified and horrible, or maybe they see the Wendigo they just killed a few weeks ago and they are freaking out. And lest we forget our witch's ability to raise the dead, right? We're in the woods, yeah? Undead Squirrel Party, let's go! It's so important to remember that dealing harm and taking harm and working with the numbers, that's all secondary to the horror aesthetic of the game, right? We need to have that spooky spook through line, right? To keep the game gripping and immersive, right? We need to make our combat feel more like a thrill ride and less like a turn-based RPG. The hunters don't need to be taking damage every turn. They need to be scared shitless every moment. I mean, don't get me wrong, the numbers are important too. There wouldn't be like a game without them, I suppose. But I trust y'all to handle that like pacing and balancing yourselves, because people can take 7 harm total. Even I can count 7. But let's just say our hunters brave the terror of the witch, defeat her, and escape her horde of zombie, ghouly rodents and nightmares, and they find out that she's not even the big bad. Uh-oh. Turns out some shadowy figure behind the scenes has been pulling the strings all along the entire campaign. The ghouls, the zombies, the witch, that Wendigo from a few weeks ago, even all the spooky ghosties haunting the mansion on the outskirts of town. That's right, we have a big bad evil guy. So the party goes back to digging for a couple more sessions, and they uncover the nature of this bad guy. He is an alpha vampire, an ancient, powerful monstrosity hell-bent on world domination with a flair for the dramatic and some serious Jim Jones vibes.
I told you we'd be deadless! We just need new shells from time to time. And plenty of souls to eat.
Turns out this villain has been lighting paranormal fires all over the world, sending your party and hunting parties like yourselves into nightmare spirals of constantly defending your towns from what goes bump in the night, all while he prepares to end the Age of Mortals and usher in the Age of Monsters.
One of us, one of us, one of us, one of us.
What we have here is a destroyer. His motivation is to bring about the end of the world as we know it. Big stuff here. But our hunters, perhaps with the help of some NPC hunters from another town, or not, I'm not going to tell you how to enrich your world building yet. But our hunters have discovered the location of the vampire's lair, armed themselves to the teeth with holy water, stakes, garlic, iron, and a cardboard cutout of Kristen Stewart, and are ready to face this threat head-on.
Now, let's do this.
So now we're dealing with a much more complex villain than our ghoulies or even our witch. There is a lot to play with narratively here, and there is a lot to... There's a lot to parse out when it comes to something like a big bad master vampire, right? Of course, he is going to be big and strong and fast and scary, but just what can he do? Well, we said he has a flair for the dramatic, so he's going to be pretty tricky, and he's going to be able to transform into various spooky animals like a raven or a cloud of bats, and of course he could rip your throat out with his teeth. But the chances are he's not going to be the only one involved in this situation. A vampire's thrall is a very powerful thing. This guy might be surrounded by hypnotized human blood banks or devoted lesser vampires. Wherever you encounter this big bad should be crawling with baddies. And that brings me to one of my favorite concepts in combat for any tabletop role-playing game: stages. Even a big boss fight can fall flat if it's just the good guys versus the bad guy in an all-out steady brawl to the death. So that's why we need to spice up our combat with some stages, right? Each stage has a goal that needs to be completed, right? A person that needs to be saved, an item that needs to be obtained, a certain amount of harm that needs to be dealt to the big bad. And each goal being accomplished triggers the next stage of the combat. So our hunters arrive at the vampire nest and encounter a horde of baddies to fight, while maybe one of your hunters notices that the big bad is drawing some of his power from a book on a stone dais somewhere in the chamber. Now, this stage of the combat can play out much like our zombie fight, right? A whole lot of chaos, a whole lot of enemies, and a lot of circumstantial threats around us. Once that book is destroyed, burned, torn, however, we move on to the next stage of combat because maybe the vampire's thrall weakens, or maybe the minions lose their hypnosis, or they lose their power, or they flee because the book has been torn. And now that leaves us to face the big bad alone. Now, in Stage 2, we are introduced to some of the real power of an alpha vampire. He is strong and he is fast, and we can play this out much like our witch fight, right? We can use tactics like hiding and confusion and supernatural powers to sort of mess with the party and to break up that monotony of just a combat, right? But our hunters are prepared and ready for him, and once they deal a certain harm threshold to the vampire, we move on to Stage 3. Maybe the big bad takes one of the hunters hostage and prepares to put him under his thrall, while his supernatural fury causes his lair to start to fall apart, causing rocks and boulders and debris to fall and rain down on the hunters. That's right, lair actions. One of the only times I will reference Dungeons & Dragons as a metric for Monster of the Week. So the hunters need to find a way to save their friend and stop the lair from collapsing. It could be a magical rune on the wall, it could be a gemstone in a statue, it could be literally anything. The point is, it breaks up the monotony of the deal harm, take harm combat, right? This gives us a moment, and only a moment, to read a bad situation, to act under pressure, literally anything other than kick some ass. We are taking away the usefulness of that move to add some danger into the scene. But once they've gotten things in the lair under control, it's time to move on to Stage 4, the final form.
Sorry, but these transformations take some time.
Wait, not that one. That's better. Our big bad gets bigger and badder as he unleashes his final, monstrous, ancient, ungodly form, and now it is time for that knockdown, drag-out cage match we've all been waiting for. Now we pull out all the stops, and playtime is over for the Master Vampire. He is bigger and stronger, but his movements are erratic in his rage. He loses some tactics in this combat, right? This gives our hunters kind of an advantage, but it's balanced out by the fact that they've probably been getting their butts relatively whooped by the last 3 stages of combat. But if they survive the fight, if they pull it off, and if they put down this supernatural monstrosity for the good of all mankind forever, the payoff, not just from this combat, but from the entire campaign, will be absolutely magical. Your players will be talking about that session for the rest of time, non-stop, for years to come, and all of their friends and all of their other Dungeons & Dragons groups will be jealous that they didn't play in your Monster of the Week campaign.
Well, I don't know whether to be jealous or weirded out.
Well, I hope y'all found this one helpful. I put some elbow grease into it. As always, drop any comments below about what you want me to cover, or if you have any questions or corrections, or you want to tell me I'm a big smooth brain dum-dum. Also, head over to the channel and check out some other content. I have a Real Play Dungeons & Dragons podcast, Lights Up, Dice Out. It's a lot of fun. I'm doing it with some really talented actors, and it's a really great time. And also head over to my Patreon if you want to see my travels around the music festivals and breweries of the world with various bands and musical groups. So, yeah, thanks again.